Sports in the 1960s were weird, man. Like, for example, it's bewildering NBA teams were scoring 110 plus points per game in an era that had no shot clock and no 3-point line. Of course, we do know why that happened. Players shot like all of the time without holding onto the ball very long, but without a lot of video evidence, it's just sort of hard to comprehend and process. There is perhaps no greater oddity in sports than George Blanda and football's single-season interception record. In 1962, George Blanda threw 42 picks playing for the Houston Oilers. That's correct, 42 interceptions. Of course, the game and its organization was way different back then. For starters, the NFL and AFL existed in their own little bubbles. The Super Bowl, and eventually the merger, were still years away before George Blanda even set this record, although the history books still show him as football's single-season interception record holder. Speaking of the AFL, it definitely had a reputation for being this wild, high-scoring league where players chucked the ball and everything was just sort of reckless. That's true to a certain extent as well. 6 of the 12 players who threw 30 or more interceptions during a season played in the pre-merger AFL. However, Blanda's record blows everyone out of the water by far. In fact, before his record-setting 1962 campaign, the record holder was Frank Tapuka, who tossed 34 picks for the Denver Broncos during that inaugural AFL season in 1960. Even today, no one has managed to throw more than 36 interceptions in a season, despite there being more games to do it in. And that's really important to note. The Pro Football Hall of Famer, George Blanda, did this in a 14-game season. Blanda just doesn't really mess around at all. He threw 6 interceptions in a game twice that year, and there was only one contest where he didn't turn the ball over. Ironically enough, it was a game the Oilers still managed to lose. I mean, dude threw 42 interceptions, he threw a pick in almost every game, and the one time he didn't do it, the Oilers lost that game. Honestly though, it's sort of par for the course of this story of football's single-season interception record. It's one of the more baffling things you'll come across in the sporting landscape. But you know what? Here at the Touchback, we're gonna try to make sense of it. Here's the story of football's single-season interception record. Houston won the first 2 AFL championship games in the first 2 seasons of the league's existence, and Blanda was a big reason why. He was the league's MVP in 1961 and put together one of the most statistically dominant seasons from a quarterback in football history up to that point. Now, he did throw 22 interceptions both in 1960 and 61, but it wasn't really a cause for concern because there were a lot of players throwing picks, as we'll get to later on in this video. Blanda had a lot of value as a kicker as well. In fact, that's probably what he became most known for as his career progressed. He was extremely accurate on extra point attempts and booted field goals of more than 50 yards. The Oilers believed in their quarterback kicker, and they never really developed a backup plan in case something did happen to him. Blanda's record-setting campaign got off to a rousing start in 1962 when he threw 6 picks in the Houston Oilers opener. Now, he cooled off, I guess you could say, in week 2 when he only threw 4 picks, but that's 10 in 2 games. The 6 interception performance was also matched in week 7 of that season. Also, it's important to note, Blanda really came on strong as the year progressed, notching 20 interceptions over the team's last 6 games. Let's just say the AFL, really football in general I guess, didn't have enough quarterbacks to go around in the 1960s. George Blanda's backup with the Oilers was Jackie Lee, a guy who did absolutely nothing in a 10-year professional career. Think of Charlie Whitehurst without the hair. Other starters in the AFL this illustrious 1962 season included Cotton Davidson with the Oakland Raiders. He started 12 games and managed to complete 37% of his passes. Yikes. Meanwhile, the New York Titans, who would eventually become the New York Jets that everyone sort of loathes today, started 3 players at the position, all of whom were terrible. In fact, only 3 of the quarterbacks who started a game in 1962 managed to throw more touchdowns than interceptions. George Blanda was allowed and able to throw 42 interceptions in the season because there was literally no one else who could play the position. One thing we have yet to talk about in this video is just how exactly the Houston Oilers fared in 1962. It only seems natural if their quarterback threw for 42 interceptions in the season, this team had to have been bad, right? Nope. The Houston Oilers were one of the AFL's best teams in 62. Despite Blanda having 42 interceptions, the Houston Oilers went 11-3 and advanced to the championship game that season. Now, we mentioned how Blanda had 20 interceptions in the last 6 games to close out the season that year. So, Houston's record in these games with 20 picks, nearly more than 3 a game. That's right, they went unbeaten, 6-0 to close the season. Blanda was second in the league in both touchdowns and passing yards while converting 48 of 49 extra points. One thing to note here is the Oilers had the AFL's second best defense, which did sort of mitigate all of the turnovers happening when they had possession of the football. Another interesting stat from the 62 season is the fact Blanda was only sacked 11 times throughout the entire year. It would indicate that maybe instead of taking sacks, he was just throwing the ball away or just getting rid of it to the other team or whatever the hell he was doing. I don't know. But it could possibly indicate that instead of taking sacks, he was willing to throw it to the other team. The most popular myth about George Blanda and football's single season interception record is that this somehow shows that he was a bad player. That's simply not the case. If you look at quarterback play in the AFL throughout the 60s, it would best be described as erratic. I mean, most teams were basically just running seamers 60 times a game. Okay, so it wasn't that simple, but you get the general idea. Passing in this era in the AFL was focused almost exclusively on intermediate to deep routes. That's why completion percentages were so low. It's why you saw a lot of interceptions. Teams were just running shot plays all of the time. That running back dump off was not really a fine art in the AFL. Additionally, pass interference was non-existent back then if you listen to stories from players. Defensive backs could do anything to slow receivers, which also contributed to lower completion percentages and increased turnovers. Blanda's 42 picks, while historic in their own right, were no worse than what every other quarterback was doing at the time. Another myth sort of floating around on Reddit, and you'll see it pop up on different websites, is that Blanda was just throwing Hail Marys instead of punting on 3rd and 4th down, which again, totally untrue if you look at the numbers. The Oilers punted 56 times in 1962, which was pretty close to the league average. If the team was really letting the quarterback throw up prayers instead of punting, they wouldn't have punted so many times. So yeah, this is just another myth which totally does not add up. Of course, we already know Houston advanced to the AFL Championship game, but how did George Blanda's season end? Well, they faced off against the Dallas Texans, who would eventually go on and become the Kansas City Chiefs, in what was widely considered one of the best football games of all time at that point, a double overtime classic. The game is also remembered for being the longest football game ever played up until that point in time. It happens to be perhaps a great microcosm of Blanda's season as well. The quarterback threw 5 interceptions on the day, and Houston actually went in trailing at halftime 17-0. Houston made a stirring comeback in the second half, sent the game to overtime, but Blanda by this point had ran out of magic and the team could not score in either overtime period. He actually ended up missing a pair of field goals on the day as well, and Houston would not go on to three-peat. Only one player has mounted a campaign to dethrone George Blanda as the record holder for football's single-season interception record. That, of course, being Vinny Testaverde in 1988. We've covered Testaverde a bit on the touchback, and you can go to the right-hand corner of your screen to learn a little bit more about what makes him so unique. But yeah, his 35 interceptions in '88 have basically been the closest anyone's come to dethroning Blanda. Today, even with 17 games, no quarterback is even going to be allowed to come anywhere close to the single season interception record. I mean, Jameis Winston tried his damnedest a few years back and could only get 30. Simply put, there's just way too much talent at quarterback in the NFL for a team and a coach to not make a switch at the position. But I think one of the most unique things to consider when we look at what George Blanda did in 1962 is just that turnovers weren't viewed as much of a negative then as they are now. A turnover now is seen as the most unacceptable play in football. Back in 62 and in the 60s in general, it was just something that happened. You just sort of lived with it and you moved on. And that's really the main difference, I think, when we look at Blanda's season throwing 42 interceptions and what Jameis Winston did throwing 30 interceptions, is that Blanda's turnovers didn't hurt the team. Like, they could cope with that because they knew that they were doing the same thing. They were turning over the opposition. Winston's picks were brutal, backbreaking for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers most cases. It didn't matter how many interceptions Blanda threw that year. He was still one of the league's best quarterbacks, if not the best quarterback. Ultimately, it's really hard putting Blanda's 42 interceptions into modern day context just because, I mean, dude threw 6 picks twice in the season and wasn't close to getting benched. And I mean, yeah, the Oilers would just roll out Blanda the next game like nothing happened. And it's a fascinating difference, and I think it really helps tell the story of football's single season interception record. This story of George Blanda and football's single season interception record doesn't end on a negative note though. He actually did pretty well for himself in the years to come. That being said, the next few years for Blanda after the loss in the AFL Championship game weren't particularly great. He would lead the league in interceptions each of the following 3 seasons, and the Oilers just sort of took a nosedive, finishing with a losing record in each year. At the age of 39, he was waived by the Oilers, and you might assume that that was the end of that story. Alas, it is not. The Oakland Raiders would end up claiming him, and he would serve as the team's kicker and backup quarterback for years and years and years to come. Blanda to this day remains the oldest player to have ever seen action in an NFL game at 48. Upon his retirement from what was then the NFL, he was the league's highest scoring player. Blanda, of course, would eventually be inducted to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1981, and it capped off a wild, illustrious career that spanned from football's wild, wild west period to a different kind of outlawish existence with the Oakland Raiders. One thing is for certain, George Blanda's single-season interception record is not being broken anytime soon, or, honestly, it's not being broken ever. Anyway, that does it for this story of George Blanda and football's single-season interception record. For the Touchback, I'm Cheyenne Hollis, and make sure you always don't throw an interception, but hashtag take it out to the 25.
Second down, 11 to go. Blanda rolling out, fires, intercepted by Dallas. Bill Hull up to the 40, 45, and Hull up to the midfield stripe. And the complexion suddenly changes. Houston had marched 54 yards. They were getting in field. Look at Blanda. He's unhappy right here at the bottom of your screen.